Back here on CBS Sports HQ, presented by Canva, Liz the Lizard and I are just going back through and looking at our fantasy results from last week. We did not have a good week, particularly from our running backs. It didn't go great, so shout out to Jacqueline for getting the win. Luckily, we're looking at our start of the week here. It is a running back courtesy of the Bengals, Chase Brown. Our Fantasy Football Today crew is hanging out with us. Jamie and Dave, who have dressed up so nicely for us on this Halloween HQ day. Guys, help me out here. My fantasy team needs some work, so give me your starts and sits for today.
It's just interesting that Jacqueline's not here and we're still talking about her fantasy team.
I know, right?
Have
to give her publicity.
It's just all Jacqueline all the time. Yes, we're going to help you with your fantasy team, hopefully help everybody with their fantasy teams. Dave, you dressed up nicely today, by the way. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween to you too, Coach.
Yes, we're going to try and coach everybody up here. Now, we're Bengals colors on purpose because Chase Brown is our start of the week, so I'm very excited about the setup for him taking on a Raiders defense that prior to last week had allowed 15.5 PPR points to every running back they faced. That number has slightly declined a little bit because Kareem Hunt only got 13.3, but that's a pretty good place to start for Chase Brown, who's been very successful as the lead running back for the Bengals, and he's done it in some tough matchups. Scored a touchdown against Baltimore, for example, did okay against the Eagles, and I think we'll see him come through with probably his best game of the season based on how this game flow should go with the Bengals hopefully playing with the lead and Brown getting the opportunity to have, again, one of the best games of the season. It's a great week for running backs, so he's only just inside the top 20, but I think he'll have one of the better performances that he's had all season.
14.4 or more PPR points in 3 of his past 4 games. That's pretty good. This Raiders defense isn't very good. You laid that out pretty clearly. When the Bengals are winning, he's been getting the ball. That's been the case 2 of the last 3 weeks. I expect it to continue. Good number 2 fantasy running back.
Let's talk about some other starts for me here. You see another running back on this list, and that's Tony Pollard, who I didn't really love going into the start of last week. Changed my opinion at the end of the week, and he rewarded fantasy managers who stuck with him. 14.7 PPR points. He's been in that number, been at that point 4 of his last 5 games. Tyjae Spears is expected to return, but I don't care. I think you use Spears as a potential sleeper for this week, but Pollard's in a great spot because this Patriots run defense has been absolutely awful. So he's got a chance to be at least a top 20 running back here. You see we're a little bit split on just how good he can be, but the setup is perfect for Tony Pollard taking on this Patriots run defense. You look at the other starts I have here, a couple wide receivers on this list, but Cade Otton is also a start for me this week. I love the setup for him and what he's been able to do the last 2 games. One without Chris Godwin and Mike Evans on the field, one when they got hurt. 20 targets over that span. He scored 2 touchdowns last week. You saw his game against the Falcons here. 9 catches, 81 yards, and the 2 scores. Dave, I don't think it's going to slow down for him. This is the best matchup of any tight end for the week because the Chiefs have allowed the most fantasy points to the position. So with the way that this game is probably going to unfold, tough to run against Kansas City, a lot of throwing for Baker Mayfield. Don't love Baker, but I do love Cade Otton. I think it's going to be a game where Baker struggles, but Otton hopefully finds the end zone, but should be a Trey McBride type of tight end where you're getting close to 10 catches with the way he should perform.
And think about how Baker used him in the passing game last week, certainly in the red zone, definitely in the end zone, and even outside of there, even a couple of downfield throws. So really, this was his best number 1 overall type of target downfield. I don't know what this Bucs offense can accomplish without Cade Otton. I don't trust any of their other wide receivers. The running backs getting checkdowns. I think the Chiefs will be ready for that. So this is where the offense is going to throw to. He's a top 5-6 type of tight end.
Yep, hopefully does well. All right, let's take a look at your starts, Dave, and see who you're backing for this week. And I got to ask you one question about Chuba Hubbard because there is the chance that Jonathan Brooks plays this week, practiced in full on Wednesday. Do you still like Hubbard as a, I'll say, must-start running back, or at least a number 2 running back, if Brooks is going to play?
Yes, because I don't think Brooks is going to play that much, and I think Chuba Hubbard's been too good. I know last week was an exception. The Broncos really locked him up, but he's averaging almost 18 touches per game, even had 17 touches last week in that tough matchup. 15.3 PPR points per game before last week, and that Saints run defense, they held on okay against the Chargers, but they still allowed a touchdown. They got annihilated by Denver the week before, Tampa Bay the week before that. They're now giving up 5.2 yards per carry to opposing running backs. I think Chuba will be just fine.
You got Josh Downs on this list as well, Dave, as a starter for you, and it's the perfect setup. You got the number 1 team in terms of most fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, and the quarterback is back.
Jamie, they've allowed 6 touchdowns, the Vikings have, to wide receivers who line up in the slot over their past 4 games. 6 touchdowns in 4 games. Cooper Kupp, the most recent one to do it last week. And Downs has at least 8 targets, at least 7 catches, and at least 15.9 PPR points in each of the 3 games he's played with Joe Flacco. He is a strong number 2 fantasy wide receiver.
Should be fun for him. Should be fun for Michael Pittman. Do you have Pittman as a starter too?
I do not have Pittman as a starter because he hasn't performed as well just overall. And with Joe Flacco, I think his best game is 14 PPR points.
Actually, it's 12.5 PPR points. But I still think just given the matchup, like I'm starting Michael Pittman and Josh Downs this week because Minnesota has been that bad. So it's just,
Sure.
like we're hoping Anthony Richardson at some point can get things going and be a fantasy quarterback that we can rely on. But Joe Flacco just makes these receivers that much better. So it's fun to see. Let's talk about some players that you're looking to avoid. We touched on Baker Mayfield as somebody that may not have the best opportunity here. You got Javonte Williams, Jalen Waddle, Jordan Addison, and Tucker Kraft. Let's start with Mayfield, Dave, because he's been a great fantasy quarterback.
Yep.
And last week was telling because first game without Godwin, first game without Evans, and he still got over 28 fantasy points. Are we just saying he should be a starter, or is this really something that we should try to avoid?
I can't buy into a quarterback who's going to make his numbers throwing to 2 running backs and 1 tight end until moving forward, until Mike Evans comes back. I don't believe in it. So that's why I'm staying away from Baker Mayfield. And there are a lot of quarterbacks that have a ton of upside this week. Bo Nix has had it for 3 of his last 4 games. Joe Flacco has it every time he steps on the field. Jameis Winston, even if he had thrown an interception on the last play of the game and not had that touchdown, he still would have been over 20 fantasy points last week.
You see, I'm with you here on the ranking. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I get it.
He's gotten the job done in games where Evans has struggled. He's gotten the job done now in a game where both guys were missing.
Can he get the job done in a really tough matchup?
I'm with you. But
the last 5 quarterbacks to play Kansas City, 16 or fewer.
We had this conversation on our podcast today. We keep starting Joe Burrow as a potential top 5 quarterback. When T. Higgins isn't there, he's terrible. And Higgins now missing, and we're still saying, okay, start Joe. Matchup is awesome.
Yeah.
But Baker has continued to deliver. And if he does it again, are we just going to say he's matchup proof and receiver proof?
I mean, maybe. It really does come down to something like that. And it could be garbage time, let's face it. There could be a situation where in the 4th quarter, he finds his 2nd touchdown, he goes over 250 yards, something like that. I do think he's going to have to throw a lot, and that is something that is Baker's favor, but there are just so many other quarterbacks I like more this week.
Jalen Waddle, somebody else that you're highlighting here that you want to sit?
I don't know why we're starting him. He's had 5 games north of 15 fantasy points since the start of last year, and he's only done it once in 6 games when he's been on the field with Tyreek Hill, with Devon Achane, and with Tua Tagovailoa. That's not a good hit rate. And he's taking on Buffalo. This is a great defense. They've been awesome against wide receivers. So Jalen Waddle, way out. He's barely in my top 36. I kind of feel like I have him too high.
It's tough to trust in his numbers against Buffalo. He's played them 5 times in the last 3 seasons, and only 2 of those games have been over 9 PPR points. And his quarterback is going to struggle also. Bad history against the Buffalo Bills. He's on the sit list for me if you want to take a look at the guys I'm trying to avoid for this week. Tua, Nick Chubb, Amari Cooper is dealing with a wrist injury and not producing so far in 2 games consistently, getting the targets that we're looking for consistently with Buffalo. Zay Flowers and Hunter Henry. Henry I'll be a little bit more excited about if Drake May does clear the concussion protocol. We'll talk about Zay Flowers in a second. But for Tua, again, similar, Dave, it's tough to trust Jalen Waddle, and Tyreek Hill last week was disappointing. But really, it's his history against Buffalo. It's what quarterbacks have done against the Bills. And really, the way to beat Buffalo is kind of what the Dolphins did last week against Cardinals, is to run against them and use the running back. So Devon Achane's a great start. Raheem Mostert could fall into the end zone. 2 touchdowns last week in the first game with Tua back. First game that those 2 guys actually finished together. So those 2 guys I like. Tyreek's just an automatic start because he's Tyreek Hill. But Jalen Waddle can get away from, and Tua Tagovailoa, as you see here, not somebody that we have a lot of faith in, and you see the head-to-head record here between Tua and Josh Allen, much more in the favor of
Allen's my
Buffalo.
#1 QB this week.
Yeah, he's top 3 for me.
Yeah.
Love the setup for him. And then in terms of Zay Flowers, get ready for the Eliminator. We'll see what Patrick Surtain is able to do. Obviously, you're more excited about him. He's more excited about him. Sportsline and I are a little bit more on the same page here. When you look at the receivers that have faced Patrick Surtain and the Broncos, #1 receivers, they are the big physical outside guys. So that is a difference in terms of what Zay Flowers does by comparison to DK Metcalf and George Pickens and Garrett Wilson. He has shut all those guys down. Mike Evans shut all of them down. #1 receivers against this team. The best one to do it so far was Jacoby Myers, had 13.8 PPR points. I think at best that's the ceiling for Zay Flowers, which would put him as a mid to low end #2 receiver if everybody else hits. There's also a situation where we just think of Zay Flowers as having a foolproof season. He's only had 4 games over 15.5 PPR points. So there's been 4 games where he struggled. And now you're throwing Deontay Johnson in the mix, which may or may not impact him over the course of the season. But it's also show up the shiny new toy. We may see a few targets go in the direction of Deontay Johnson. I don't think it's an automatic start for Zay Flowers, so you can try and talk me out of it.
He's a #2 fantasy receiver. He's got way too much upside. And when I think about Deontay Johnson going to the Ravens, I'm not sure how much he'll play in his first game, and we've kind of seen that from receivers who have been traded. We saw it with Cooper. Cooper still hasn't played a full game with Buffalo. DeAndre Hopkins barely played in his first game. Same thing with Devontae Adams with the Jets. I'd be surprised if Deontay Johnson had that big role. The fact that he's so versatile and that they can use him on screens, short throws, and also deep plays, that makes him tough to defend for one guy. And so it might be Denver putting up a game plan to say, okay, we're not going to let this guy beat us on passing downs. But how about those 1st and 10 plays? Those aren't necessarily passing downs plays. They could use play action off that, and Zay Flowers can strike big. Also, a lot of Flowers' bad games came when Derrick Henry went crazy.
They're 9-point favorites.
I don't know if Derrick,
favorites.
First of all, I like getting the points with Denver. And second of all, I think Derrick Henry will be just fine. I think he'll score and do all the things that Derrick Henry does. I don't think he's getting 28 carries for 175 yards against this Denver defense. So I'm good with Zay Flowers, especially in PPR leagues.
Yeah, I would try to avoid him just based on what Surtain does against #1 receivers. It has been an elimination game for those guys. Check out our Fantasy Football Today podcast, wherever podcasts are found. We're helping you dominate your fantasy leagues. You can find us on YouTube as well. Scan the QR code to make it easy on yourself. You want to win your fantasy leagues, the Fantasy Football Today podcast.